Hey, we're back. So, hello everybody. You see a familiar face up here next to mine. Actually, much better looking, obviously. But Scott's back. We had such a fun time doing. I had such a blast doing the last session with Scott last time, and we didn't even. We just kind of got the top couple layers of our myth list covered. So we figured we'd come back and do it again. So just to introduce Scott Alexander's here with Jairus Marketing. We're talking, startup, product launch myths.
Yep.
Some focus on startups, some not on startups, but mainly the myths that we both run into throughout our career. So yeah, we're back and we're going to continue from where we started. Before we kind of dive into the first myth again, let's if you have any comments, thoughts, if you disagree with this, those are kind of our favorite comments because that gets us into it. And Scott and I, we were just talking about that before we came on. We both look at the world a little bit differently. We bring a little different viewpoint. And that's one of the things we like doing is sort of testing each other or challenging each other. So if you have any comments, any thoughts, as I said, if you disagree with anything we say, put your opinions out there and let's debate them. Let's talk about it. One of the things that's true and that is a truth, not a myth, is that none of us have all the answers. And I think Scott and I talked about this a little bit last time. A lot of times there's principles you can follow for doing things better, but success always because every company's different, every product's different, every market's different. The ultimate success always lives in the nuance. But Scott, do you have anything to share before we dive back in here on this?
I think probably the only thing that I would say is business is a contact sport, and it's fun to talk about it. But then I also think the thing that's really cool is to say, all right, now that I have this additional information, what do I do with it? How do I go about implementing it in my business or what I'm doing, that sort of thing. So hopefully this is not just a good conversation. This is something that's going to spur some action.
Well, maybe you and I can kind of focus on that as we go through the myths. Maybe we can make sure we give some, not just tell them what not to do, maybe give them some ideas of things a little bit, how you and I might address some, address some of these things. So one of the ones we were talking about last time, and I know you have some thoughts on this, Scott, and I kind of shoved it in at the end of the last one, and I don't know why I did, but I did.
Yeah.
But this idea of hiring from big companies. And I mean, one of the things, I see it happen all the time. And in some sense, it's from if you're in a startup and you're a smaller company, if you're trying to raise money, it's kind of nice to have a big company resume on your, list, your team list. But honestly, it doesn't usually serve well for market success in my experience. I don't know, what do you, and I got all sorts of thoughts, but what are your thoughts about that, Scott?
I agree with you. I think that we were talking about this a little before we went live. I think that the job of like a VP of marketing at a large company is different than the role of a VP of marketing or sales for that matter. In a small company, right? The bigger you get, the bigger the organization gets, the more you're sort of marshaling resources and that sort of thing. And the smaller you get, the earlier stage you are, the more it's, I don't know, I'm using contact sport a lot, but the more contact you have to have, you end up being more of a player coach than just a coach. And I think that translates into the skills that you need to have to be successful are not exactly the same, right? Good marketing is good marketing. Good sales is good sales. But the reality is what it takes to be able to bring an innovative product to market in a small startup company is not necessarily the exact same things that will help you be successful as a VP of marketing at fill in the blank medical device company.
Yeah, you got me making faces over here.
I know. I was like, man, I'm saying something good or something bad.
Well, I think you're being very nice about it. I think they're dramatic. From a sales perspective, I think the skill set's almost dramatically different. I think that, well, I mean, I remember there's a quote from Steve Blank. Do you know who Steve Blank is?
Oh yeah, yep.
I
I have
figured it.
four stages of
Anyway,
epiphany right down there. Yep.
yeah, there you go. If I said, I've got it right there.
Yep.
So, um, but he talks about what a startup is, and this is true for any disruptive product you're going to market with. It's a temporary company seeking, trying to find a repeatable business model.
Yep.
Well, when you're launching a disruptive technology, you might even say it's a temporary sales team looking for a repeatable, proven sales process.
Yeah.
That's not what a VP of sales trained in doing. You know, in almost every big company I've ever been involved with or in, what they're trained in is executing a proven process over and over again. Their execution, not this discovery set. So, you know, you bring that type of person that's trained in that into a launching of a product or into a startup company. What they're going to do is they're going to build out a sales machine before thinking that that's what's needed to execute. But the problem is if you don't give that machine a repeatable process to execute against, that machine's going to be operating at 20% efficiency or something like that. So
I think you're right. And just kind of build on that. Large companies have capabilities and resources that, you know, if we're launching a disruptive product, we're new to market, that sort of thing, we can't leverage. And so pre-existing channel is a good thing. And if you think about, right, I was back at Medtronic, you know, I was Medtronic for 10 years. We had 1,000 sales reps in our division. Like if you're new to market or you've got a disruptive product, you don't have that. GPO contracts, you start to think about the ability to tie multiple products together. And like, there's a lot of things that you growing up in that side of the world, you're used to having, which again, not saying it's good or bad. Heck, it's nice to have, right?
But, so let me ask you a question. You probably know more about this than I do.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't do this work. I wish I'm talking with some companies about possibly doing it, but launching disruptive products in big companies. How do they manage disruptive products in a big company? Are they good at it?
No.
Okay.
I did this for most of my career at Medtronic, and I'll tell you, it's a challenge, right? If you start to think about, like if you're bringing up disruptive products. I was literally part of a group called Disruptive Products and Technologies for several years.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah. So I'm not thinking
I'm asking the right man the question here.
Yeah, it's a challenge. Like it's a challenge as a big company because there's, and I don't want to go. I mean, I can go for days on this, but you know, so some of the challenges are from a finance perspective. If you start to look at, okay, you're starting a brand new platform. Like let's take Ligashire, which is a product that's been incredibly successful for Covidien and now Medtronic. So if you look at the history of that, when it was going up against electrosurgery in the core business of Valley Lab at the time, all of the expenses and the costs to develop electrosurgery had already been spent. They were sunk costs. Yep. So when you're doing a calculation of where do you put your dollars from a very logical, rational, realistic finance perspective, starting a new platform like Ligashire is way below the line relative to, okay, we've already spent all this stuff on this electrosurgery system. And it's only because of a couple of folks who shielded and hid and protected, and then a couple of acquisitions and sales and that sort of thing, that Ligashire, which is now I believe, multi-billion-dollar product, ever saw the light of day.
Yeah.
And so from the very beginning, it's challenging. And then you start to think about on the commercial side, it's the same thing. You've been sort of optimizing for a certain business model, and disruptive products require a different approach. And that's why it's a big challenge for a lot of companies, right?
So typically, do they try to fit it into the way the system's working now and try to jam it in? Is that what they try to do instead of building the approach that's appropriate for that product in that market type of thing?
Yeah, and I can only speak to my experiences, but you know, what I saw was, one, there's the expectation that it's like you've got children, right? Like if you think about it, you've got one kid who's, you know, let's say we're playing basketball, right? And the idea is you got one kid who's 16 and he's hitting his growth spurts, and like and he's shooting and playing and having a great time. And then you have a 6-year-old, right? The kid who's just playing the game. And again, from a logical, rational, realistic, perspective, you're going to hold them because it's $1 and one is equal, is the same amount. You're going to say, hey, they need to compete on par, unless you have really good rules to sequester dollars for innovation versus dollars for commercial, sort of where you're going to make your money.
Yeah. And I'm going to jump on that one too, because honestly, the dollars are not equal in one or the other. From a VP of sales where he's trying to drive revenue, that dollar's equal to the other. But the truth is, a disruptive product is unequal in a couple ways. If it's like the Ligashore, what's the name?
Ligashore. Yep.
Ligashore. There was advantages around that product that you don't have around the established product. One is, I guarantee the margins were higher.
Oh, they were. Yep.
So as soon as you bring in something if you're in a mature market, your margins have automatically have already been eroded. When you come in and you disrupt the market with something new that brings true innovation, your margins are higher. That's number one. So that has a huge impact on the bottom line. But that's one reason why $1 for dollar it's clearly not even.
Right.
But the bigger one, and you and I could just keep riffing on this direction and not go into any other myths, so we got to be a little careful about that. But this is a pet peeve of mine. The other one is to open new accounts. If you're in the mature market competing with other mature players in that marketplace, you can't, and there's stronghold accounts of the competitors, you're not going to break into that account with a mature product that's apples for apples, or basically apples for apples. The only way you're going to break in is with a disruptive product. So that product, that Ligashore, I'm sure if it was done well, once they got into a new account that they hadn't been in before, you can drag the whole product line behind you there. So there's huge upside in value. So it's not dollar for dollar, but this is the reason why you don't want a VP of sales running your sales in a startup company, or I think I haven't done it. I don't think you want them running it in a mature company either, because the rules of the game and how you approach it and everything they've been trained to do is counterintuitive to what you need to do for disruptive technologies.
Yeah, I think, just kind of building on that. When I think about dollar for dollar, I also think about investment, right? Because it takes money to make money. And so then the idea is, if I'm the CFO of J&J and I'm looking on where I'm going to put my dollars, do I invest in a company that's earlier in the sales cycle and sort of growth curve, or something that's much more to the maturity side? And I, by the way, I'm a publicly traded company and I have to report earnings and that sort of thing, right? The natural thing to do is to say, well, I'm going to focus in on those things that are going to return dollars in a shorter period of time. And that's just a natural piece. So then as a leader, you have to say, we're going to sequester dollars. X percent of our business is going to go to investing in that next thing. But so anyway, I say that to bring us back into the conversation to say, and these are all, again, reasonable decisions to make. But the reality is it does train you into playing a certain type of a game. If you're a J&J, you're Baxter, you're, Medtronic, you name it, right? Like you're going to do things a certain way that don't necessarily translate into what you would do if you were the new kid on the block.
Yeah, I agree. And this is let's take it back all the way back to the beginning to the myth. This is why you don't want to hire the VP of sales at a Medtronic running your sales in a startup. And let's go on to the next myth. But I'll tell you one thing, just for everybody in the room. There's a great article. I don't know if you've heard. Have you ever heard of the sales learning curve? It's a Harvard Business Review article.
I have not. No.
Okay, this thing, it probably is 10, 15 years old. It's a Harvard Business Review article. It's called The Sales Learning Curve from Mark Leslie and Charles Holloway. It talks about the different types of sales, the different stages in sale, and the different type of sales rep you need for this different stages. What we're talking is about a mature stage or a scale stage. in this early stage, this kind of discovery stage where you're trying to where you're seeking to find the repeatable sales process.
Yep.
There's this thing that they've coined, they call them Renaissance reps.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same thing. You want, if those are the type of people you want, the best analogy I can give you, it's kind of the difference between your infantry and your special forces.
Mm-hmm.
So, your Rangers and your SEAL team, that type of stuff. It's kind of that difference, from an analogy standpoint. But it's a great article. I recommend that anybody on this call that, if you're really interested in figuring out how to do this or how to pick the right people at the early stage, pick up that article and read it. It's absolutely brilliant.
I think I'm going to maybe I'll keep us here and pivot the point of advice a little bit to say it's not just about hiring, but it's you don't want to run. If you're a startup, you're trying to do something disruptive, right? You're early to the market. The thing is, you don't want to run the same playbook that the large incumbents do, because they're doing something different than what you're doing. You're trying to gain market share. They're trying to maintain market share. You're trying to change the hearts and minds of prospects. They're trying to maintain and slightly modify. And so even the definition of what's considered innovation is different between the two audiences. So from a marketing playbook standpoint, how many of us have walked into trade shows and you see, you name your, big Fortune 500 incumbent has a massive booth with a big spinning sign with their name on it and that sort of thing. And the truth of the matter is, you cannot, and frankly should not, compete with those folks, right? If you look at, are you familiar with 37 Signals, the guys that do Basecamp? Jason Fried and David Hannemeyer Hansen. They're pure. I mean, they're genius. I mean, they're geniuses. They're awesome. They have a podcast. They have books. They're worth checking out. They have a blog.
What's the name of it again?
So the name of the company is 37 Signals. So 37signals.com.
Okay.
And the CEO is a guy named Jason Fried.
Okay.
And the COO is a guy named David Hannemeyer Hansen.
Okay.
And they built a platform called Basecamp.
Got my note.
There you go. Yeah. And so they have a podcast called Rework. So like do work. They have a book called Rework. But I mean, these guys really have it figured out, and they're absolutely worth looking into. Okay. I would say they fall into the same camp, albeit a little bit, a little bit more developed than like your Steve Blanks, your Eric Ries, like seeing the world differently kind of guys. But one of the things that they talk about is like, don't play your competitor's game.
Yeah.
And so let's say, Chris, you and I are heads of marketing and sales for somebody who's got a disruptive product in the, cardiology space. The worst thing we could do is try and outcompete Medtronic in the things that Medtronic does well.
Yep.
Right. So we have to be different. And I think it comes into a couple of pieces. One is you probably need to make sure you have the right team, but then for you to get growth, you don't need to move 50 health systems towards buying more of your product. You need to have like 3.
Yes.
And then you need to go deep in those and really sort of get as much of the share of wallet as you can. And then be much more sort of lockstep. I was kind of mentioning, I was alluding to this earlier, but I think it's more important to be rich than famous. And the idea is, I think there's a natural inclination to do 2 things when you're trying to do something disruptive. Number one is to collect the logos. So did I get Mayo? Did I get Cleveland Clinic? Is MD Anderson using my product? Whatever the case might be. That's number one. And then number 2 is to get kind of as many logos as you can. So saying, hey, not only do we want Mayo, but we also want Cleveland Clinic, and that becomes a key driver.
Yeah.
As opposed to saying, I'm going to go and I'm going to find the people that really resonate with what I've got. And then I'm going to go deep with them. And that may be somewhere in Paducah, Kentucky. And, and we're going to get as deep as we can. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go with another one and another one. And we're going to focus on profitability as opposed to focusing on let's burn as much cash as we can to get into Mayo, where it's a red ocean. right?
Well, let's talk about that myth. I mean, there's a whole bunch of places we can take what you just said, but let's talk about the myth of the academic medical center, or the big medical center. But before we do that, tell me, so you're going kind of narrow and deep is kind of what you're saying, or maybe even not narrow and deep, but very targeted and deep.
Yeah.
Like, so I get your understanding, and you're getting all the revenue out of that, all the learning and the revenue out of that. Want to get so tell me how that translates into long-term growth.
Well, I think what you're trying to do, it's a great question. So it translates into long-term growth. Thank you for the setup. Because what you're doing is you're trying to figure out what's the thing that gets people to perk their ears up and to say, yes, I want to start to buy your stuff.
Yes.
And where are the issues and what's going to be the hiccup and that sort of thing. And so being purposeful about understanding that early revenue is as much about learning about what's going to drive future revenue as it is about what's coming in the door today.
Oh, I disagree with that completely.
Okay. Really?
I think early revenue is much, much more about what you learn.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
I know. You said it was equal.
Okay. Yeah. Well,
so
yeah.
Let me put it this way. If I have a choice of revenue or learnings early on, 1,000% of the time, I will go for the learning.
Yeah.
That's much, much, much more valuable than that revenue dollar. Now, I get that you have stakeholders in companies that you have to take care of, investors that are looking for a certain thing.
Yep.
But the best way for me to serve them is to get that knowledge.
It is.
Yeah.
And I think taking an approach, like, did we go through the EKG, the remote EKG example last time we talked?
I don't remember. I can't.
All right, well, I'll give it to you again because I feel like this is really indicative of what we see. Because again, we do this for 50 some odd companies today. Like, we do this a lot. We had a company, Israeli company, great technology in the remote EKG space. And they were coming to the US and wanted to figure out, like, what's a growth plan look like. And they had what had worked for them in other countries is, let's go focus in on academic medical centers. Like, let's go get the Cleveland Clinics, the Mayos, that sort of thing. And we were able to convince them that, like, hey, that's great. And we should include all the cardiologists in the United States. And oh, by the way, not just the cardiologists, but let's focus on internal medicine, and let's think about family medicine and primary care. Yeah. And, fast forward to what we found that the people that were buying their product, this was like May of 2020. So COVID, if you remember, is raging. We're wiping down our groceries. Like, we don't know what the heck is happening in the world.
Yeah.
The people that were buying the remote EKGs were not Cleveland Clinic and Mayo and you name it. It was private practices in West Des Moines, Iowa, and these rural communities where they have, and it wasn't cardiologists, it was internal medicine, it was primary care, because they're taking care of these patients that are in farming communities and all over who knows where, and they have to have it. And the value proposition of what the product offered was so great that they said, I'm in. And they're buying these in like one call. Yeah, I'll take 10 of them.
So like a couple things there. I bet you none of the big boys were calling on these accounts.
Guaranteed they weren't. Yeah, exactly.
So that's one thing. And so once you in that regard, you kind of went broad first.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't well, first of all, you had a customer client that wanted to go academic medical centers, and you convinced them that wasn't the only thing you should do. Let's throw a little broader.
Yep.
Once you did that, did you go narrow? Once you figured out kind of the persona, the value proposition, what I call the delta between the current state and the future state, the high pain today and the benefit of solving that problem. Did you then go narrow?
Yeah, you start to narrow it down. You start to figure out what are the value propositions that our customer base aligns to, right. And you can get much more intelligent about that. And again, it goes back to, is it better to be rich or famous? Like, I'm a fan of generate revenue. Like, how do you make sure that your company is going to be around a year from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now?
Yep.
You make money. And so
And also, I think the other thing I think that's really important about what you said is you go where the problem is so big and the benefit of the solution is so differentiated, right? That you kind of it becomes a no-brainer from a market entry and adoption standpoint.
That's right.
So go ahead.
I was say you can do that now at scale, whereas you couldn't, pre-COVID. Like if you think about, and this is just a quick plug for like why you should be doing digital marketing as a startup. You can reach all 30,000 cardiologists with one campaign without having a single rep in the field.
Yep.
Whereas if you think about where we were in 2018, the only avenue, or really the only significant avenue you had to deliver messaging and try to change hearts and minds is through a rep. And so I see a huge leveling of the playing field in terms of rep access is way down. So that skill or that asset that Medtronic has, 1,000 reps, is way more normalized to where you are if you're, a startup trying to get going. Right.
So when you guys launched, and I love this. So when you guys launched that product, you kind of covered the field with your and kind of looked where the signal bounced back from, kind of like radar, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Signals back. But then I imagine you probably got very targeted with your messaging once you figured out where that signal was coming from.
Mm-hmm. Yep, exactly. Yeah.
Because I think the thing that could be misconstrued in this a little bit is, or the challenge you could get into by going broad is you get this little signal here, little signal here, little signal here, little signal here, and you try to chase it all.
Right. Yeah.
And if you do that, you cannot get the repeatability. And if you can't get the repeatability, you can't get the scale.
I think you're right. I would also say that the people that are here's what was a key learning for me in this process was, and I'm gonna say this, you're like, well, no, duh. But the reality is there are certain personas, and they are not geographically located in the same place.
Yeah.
And so just because you were getting sales in, Salem, Oregon, and West Des Moines, Iowa, and Macon, Georgia, like that's what I think most people would think of in terms of like, well, I want everybody in, you pick your big city, Chicago. Like we just want to focus in on Chicago. But the reality is what you're finding is these providers, it was actually like concierge medicine was one of the big areas of growth for them. Again, this is years ago, so I feel like I can talk about it. But the concierge med guys were interested because they were responsible for these patients and they didn't know how they're going to get in front of them.
But a very different value proposition than that guy in South Dakota, though.
Well, you're going to have a couple of different value propositions, right?
No, I get that. So you found signals in a couple different places, but and for the sake of this kind of dispelling the myth, it wasn't academic medical centers,
right? Yes.
Which is, and kind of getting back to a little bit. I mean, everybody. That's the myth that we're kind of dispelling now.
Yep.
And it's very common. Let's go get the big names.
Yep.
Now the other thing I think that the challenge with the big names, that's where all the big players are too.
Yeah. And
two things. One is that's where all the big players issue and all the small players. Everybody's going at them.
Yep.
Right. Number one. So you're going into the red water, not blue water, right?
Yep.
With that analogy. So there was another thing I was thinking about that you go.
Just as you're thinking.
The other thing is, good Lord, the sales cycles in those places are. I mean, so let me ask this: what was the average sales cycle of the guy in Des Moines, Iowa, versus what was the average sales cycle of the guy in Des Moines, Iowa?
I mean, they were buying them on a first phone call.
Yeah, so the sales cycle was a day or two.
No, if that. It was like literally, what do you have? Yes, I need 10 of those. Send me the PO. Like that's.
As opposed to a 6-month at best case sales cycle in an academic medical center, right?
Yeah, I've got a buddy of mine, and we're trying to help him out. He's working on a really interesting technology around tracking clinical trials.
Yeah.
And he's been working with a large academic medical center. You would know if I mentioned it.
Yep.
For 2 years. It's like 18 months, right? To just try and get things going. And they've already said they wanted it.
Yes.
So
they said they wanted it 23 months ago.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
It's just like, is this burn? Like, And so then if you're thinking about, I got a startup, like here's where I put myself. I got a startup. I have a certain amount of cash in the bank. Should I go after University of fill in the blank, or should I go after people in Kentucky? Like,
yeah, I know what I'm doing, but I'm doing it every time. But
right.
you and I think about this all the time. Now,
Yep.
it doesn't mean you ignore the academic medical centers. There's
Sure.
some value in that.
Yep.
But you got to be realistic, and you do. We hear, you hear it all the time. Hear it all the time. We get 2 or 3 of those, and the world's going to be our oyster. First of all, that's not true.
Yep.
Second of all, getting 2 or 3 of those might be long. The company might be long closed down before you ever get them.
Yeah. The other thing that we find is, because I think there's a myth around, we may have talked about this last time, but there's a myth that you need to have KOLs on board to be able to get something adopted. And we don't find that. We don't find that if, it certainly helps, but if you are meeting the needs of an individual provider, they're gonna go with your stuff.
And that's, I think the same holds for publications. If we get in the right journals with the right publications, that's all we need. Well, first of all, KOLs, if you don't have a critical problem, an unmet need that you're addressing for a specific persona, I don't care who KOL you have behind you. I don't care what publication you have behind you. They're not going to buy it, especially in the clinical world versus the academic world. Remember, the truly clinical world is driven by their P&L, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Completely. Academic world, it's a mixed bag on what, they're motivated by different things. So if you're trying to, and that's where the real market is, it's with the, it's out in the world. It's not, the big, larger market or the bulk of the market's not in the academic medical centers for most products. So.
I also think the folks, the providers, let's say you're calling on doctors, right? You're calling on cardiologists. The cardiologists are going to say, well, who else is using it? Which is a very common question. And that's where people are like, I got to have KOLs because I have to be able to say, hey, it's Dr. Smith over at St. Selma University or whatever. Like that's why you're doing it. So you can have a conversation with somebody who's going to say who else is using it. The truth of the matter is they're going to find another objection after that.
Yes.
And so they're not your early customers.
Yes.
They're maybe early majority, probably more like late majority if they're asking who else is doing it. And so you're calling on the wrong people if they're asking like who else is using it and that sort of thing.
Or that's your qualifying process. If as soon as they start asking those questions for a disruptive product, they just disqualify themselves as an early adopter, which is, but that's a whole nother discussion is how do you sell? And I honestly believe early sales of disruptive technology, it's not a sales process, it's a selection process. And you got to keep in mind that there's only 14% of the overall population that's an innovator early adopter. So you're deselecting it. You got to quickly deselect that 86% that's not your early customer.
Yep. Exactly.
But now we get back to the original myth of hiring from the big company, because there's no way that I could go to a VP of sales and say, listen, our biggest qualifying job is to eliminate 80% of our potential customer base.
Yeah, exactly. Not going to happen. They're like, what?
Not gonna happen. But if you're going to be effective launching something that's disruptive and different, you've got those 86% will take up 99% of your time if you keep them in your pipeline.
Yeah.
So,
well, the other thing,
we've done it again.
Yeah.
We covered a myth in the
We're out of time. I mean, we got through one myth. This is wild.
I know. Well, we got through kind of two.
Yeah, two-ish. Yeah.
Two-ish. But we've done it again, and we're running over, so we better wrap it up.
Okay.
We might have to do part 3. So
I'm always happy to talk. I enjoy it. So.
Okay. Well, it's been wonderful again. We're over time. Hopefully, everybody's enjoyed it. And enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah. Thanks.